of them am I selling? The mix of stuff. And on the bottom line, try to look at the relative capital and labor intensity of what it is that you're choosing to do. Those intensities can vary dramatically. Boeing and Airbus make roughly the same number of airplanes every year. For Boeing, it takes 110,000 employees. For Airbus, it takes 36,000. Guess which one has more machines? One looks like an anthill when it makes a plane. The other one looks like it's a bank holiday and nobody's come to work that day. The level of capital intensity in that business has wide variances, much wider than we see in most any other sector. Very different labor capital ratios, but we both make planes that roughly the same quality. They don't fall out of the sky that often. And, you know, by and large, you and I couldn't care less as long as it gets us from point A to point B with isolated indifference. So, and they do quite well, thank you, in an industry characterized by duopoly. With such different production systems, it's hard to believe they're making the same thing. So there are many ways, in other words, to get productivity. What you see in an Airbus is phenomenal labor productivity because of all that capital. And Boeing, you see phenomenal capital productivity because of all that labor. The total factor productivity for both of them is roughly the same. They just do it in different ways.
I reserve the last question for myself. What advice do you have for us to get into the top 10?
Well, you probably need to double your population, so you want to. So I need to get out of here so you can get to work. We need more social interactions would be one way to get there quickly. With 20-something, tell yourself the top 20, not the top 10. I'm unable to think about how you can get yourself to the top 10. If you think of the top 20, where you would find an Australia, where you would find a Taiwan. In other words, economies where I have roughly the same population, yet somehow they're converting that population to much greater wealth than we are currently in Malaysia. So what is it that they're doing that we're not doing? Well, I think you'd find in both Taiwan and Australia, investors, be they domestic investors or foreign investors, by and large find governments in place where they are less worried about corruption, less worried about the normal inefficiencies that occur in any government, but without necessarily the transaction cost and the rent seeking on top of it. So to the extent that applies to Malaysia or any other economy, keep in mind that that one of the more interesting phenomena, back to the institutional dimensions, is the critical role that government plays, not just as a facilitator and an investor and all this kind, but also as this is a horrible English word, I don't even think it exists, a deterrent to that kind of investment. It will lead your domestic investors typically to take money out of the country, often because it's money that's tarnished in some way. So 3 factors. One would be, I would focus on that, so that you have as efficient a machinery as you can get from your government apparatus. The second would be to not try to be all things to all people. What do I mean by that? One of the things that all of these countries, especially in that second tier, but also in the first tier, share in common is a phenomenal degree of specialization. So they have figured out where they are best suited to play, both for their own domestic needs, but also in the global economy. And that's a hard thing to do, because what a strategy does for a business or for a government is not just include. The most important thing that a strategy does is exclude. A strategy tells you what not to do, as distinct from what always to do. And I think you'll find that many economies decide they want to be in every industry. You know, we used to say, this will date me, You know, every country had to have an Aswan Dam. Every country had to have a national airline. Every country had to have a steel mill. Maybe, just none of those folks, that we don't have a successful model today. It might have worked at some earlier time, but we don't have a successful model today of somebody that's that different. Even economies the size of the United States have found that specialization is starting, it pays huge dividends. And remember, that specialization not just in products and services, in goods and services, that specialization in your capital and labor markets. And that would get me to my third and final point on this one, which is make the tough decisions that are required to get you from here to there in the sort of long cycle infrastructure, by which I mean education, by which I mean physical infrastructure of various types. These are often very hard to sustain, especially in downturns such as the one we're currently in. Yet there's probably no time in which they're more important than during these downturns. I mean, the irony of all ironies is that as Britain thinks about how it might right the ship, it decides to massively cut the educational underpinnings of its growth. Now, in the short term, it will pay dividends. We will balance budgets in that way. My suspicion is you're basically stealing from the long term in order to satisfy the short term under those kinds of things. But obviously, tough decisions are going to need to be made. But it's trying to understand how to get from here to there. I'll end with one final thought. When Albert Einstein was at Princeton, he was asked by a reporter if he had only an hour to solve a difficult problem, how would he think about it? How would he invest his 60 minutes? And without hesitation, he said, I spend the first 50 minutes getting the question right, and the last 10 minutes answering the right question. One of the things I've learned over the last several years, and especially as a consultant, is that I spend an inordinately large amount of time with people who have absolutely brilliant answers to the wrong questions. But brilliant. Nothing short of brilliant. I mean, some of the cleverest minds have been applied to all the wrong sorts of issues. Getting the question right, whether that's for Malaysia or getting the question right, doing that work up front best, is absolutely critical. I prefer to get the question, to have an okay answer to the right question than a brilliant answer to the wrong question. And so I would leave you with that thought as well, because it's sort of an overarching one. What I find, especially in Asia, is the perfect is almost always the enemy of the good. The bad is not the enemy of the good. The perfect is the enemy of the good. And so we often find ourselves trying to make sure we know everything before we act. Certainly that is something I've lived through in my time in Southeast Asia. Failing to realize that the best we can hope for is maybe 60 or 70% of the information I need, at which point I've got to make a decision. And it's the best decision I can make given the facts I have available to me at that time. And I need to be able to change that decision if competing information should unfold. That's it for me. Thank you all very much. I want to thank you for
Thank you very much. I think you answered the questions brilliantly. I don't know how much challenge you were in Singapore, but certainly described.
I'll tell you what I told us. I'm more challenged here than I was there, which is what I told them there.
You did take 15 minutes to think about that. So once again, can we give him a big clap?